Story number 1 of 5 science fiction stories by Mack Reynolds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 5 science fiction stories by Mack Reynolds. Story number 1, Mercy Flight. The story was first published in Planet Stories, July 1951. The phone rang, and Ed Carey wasn't doing anything, so he picked it up and said, "Yeah." He said "yeah" a few more times, his eyes widening infinitesimally each time, and finally wound up with, "Okay, Bunny." He hung up and said, "That was Bunny, up in Oneonta. She says a guy is coming in from Luna with a kid for emergency hospitalization, radiation burns or something." Jake was sitting back in his swivel chair, his feet on the desk and his hands clasped behind his head. He growled. "That's the trouble with women in this game. They've got no story sense. She phones all the way from Oneonta on a story that's been run 100 times. Every time somebody gets good and sick up on Luna, they bring 'em to Earth for treatment." He shrugged. "Okay, so it's a kid this time. Do up about a stick of it, Carey, and we'll put it on page 3 if you can work it into a tearjerker." Ed Carey said, "You didn't let me finish, Jake. Something's wrong with this guy's radio." Somebody on the rewrite desk said, "Something wrong with his radio?" "He's gotta have his radio or he can't come in." Jake took his feet from the desk and sat up. "What do you mean, something's wrong with his radio?" "Bunny said he's calling for his landing instructions, but they can't get anything back to him. He's just reached Brinchulush, and he's in free fall now. It'll be 4 days before he gets here. That's the way they work it. He's supposed to get in touch with this spaceport he wants to land at, and—" "I know how they work it," Jake growled. "See if there's anything on the last newswire from Luna about him." Phil Mooney flicked his set on again and repeated carefully, "Calling Oneonta Spaceport. Phil Mooney, outbound Luna, calling Oneonta Spaceport. Come in, Oneonta." "Calling Phil Mooney, calling Phil Mooney. Oneonta Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney. Come in, Mooney." He cast a quick glance back at the child, strapped carefully in the metal bunk. She was unconscious now, possibly as a result of the acceleration in leaving Luna. He'd had to reach a speed of approximately 2 miles per second to escape Earth's satellite, and that had called for more G's acceleration than Lillian's sick body could bear. His lips thinned back over his teeth. It would be even worse when they came in for landing, and he'd have to brake against Earth's gravity. He switched on the set again to give it another try. Instructions were to contact the spaceport at which you planned to land as soon as possible. There was plenty of time, of course, but the sooner the better. He said, "Calling Oneonta Spaceport. This is Phil Mooney, Luna, calling Oneonta. Come in, Oneonta." "Calling Phil Mooney, calling Phil Mooney. Oneonta Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney. Come in, Mooney." Ed Carey came back to the city room with a sheet of yellow paper that he'd torn off the radio type. He said, "Here it is, Jake. This kid, her name is Lillian Marshall, is the only survivor of an explosion at that nuclear fission laboratory they had on the dark side. Her old man and her mother were working under this Professor Deems, both of them killed." His eyes went on scanning the story. "Evidently this Phil Mooney runs an unscheduled space liner. Anyway, he blasted off to rush the kid to an Earth hospital." Jake took the dispatch and scowled at it. "Carey," he growled, "see what we got on this Phil Mooney in the morgue." He rubbed the end of his nose thoughtfully. "They'll probably pick him up all right when he gets nearer." Somebody on rewrite said, "It doesn't make any difference how far he is. They should be able to reach him even if he was halfway to Mars. Something's wrong with his set." He decided to try one of the other spaceports. As a matter of fact, it made very little difference at which of them he landed. There'd be suitable hospital facilities within reasonable distance of any spaceport. He was 3 days out now, and, according to Spaceway's custom, had to let them know he was coming in. It wasn't like landing an airplane. They want plenty of time to prepare for a spacecraft's arrival. He said, "Calling New Albuquerque Spaceport. Calling New Albuquerque Spaceport. Phil Mooney, Luna, calling New Albuquerque. Please come in, New Albuquerque." "Calling Phil Mooney, calling Phil Mooney. New Albuquerque Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney. We are receiving you perfectly. Come in, Mooney." He tried once more. "Calling New Albuquerque Spaceport, calling New Albuquerque Spaceport. Please come in, New Albuquerque. Emergency. Repeat, emergency. Please come in, New Albuquerque." "Calling Phil Mooney, calling Phil Mooney. We are receiving you perfectly, Mooney. Come in, Mooney." Kitty Kildare took up her notes and prepared to make her way back to her own tiny office. "I've got it, Jake," she said breathlessly. Kitty was always breathless over any story carrying more pathos than a basketball score. "My column tomorrow will have them melting. Actually, I mean." Jake shuddered inwardly after she left. Ed Carey came up and drooped on the edge of the desk. "Here's the dope on this Phil Mooney, Jake," he said. "He's about 30, was in the last war, and saw action when we had our space forces storming New Petrograd. Did some fighting around the satellites, too. Piloted a one-seater, got a couple of medals, but never really made big news." "Got any pics of him?" Ed Kelly shook his head. "Like I said, he never really made the big news. Just one more of these young fellows that saw plenty of action, and when the war was over was too keyed up to settle down to everyday life." Jake picked up the thin folder and riffled through the few clippings there. "What's he doing now?" he growled. "Evidently, when the war ended, he got one of these surplus freighters and converted it. Name of his company is Mooney Space Service. Sounds impressive, but he's the only one in it. Probably going broke. Most of these guys are. Can't make the grade against the competition of Terra Luna Spaceways and the other big boys with the scheduled flights." The city editor scratched the end of his nose speculatively. "Maybe we ought to have Jim do up an editorial on these unscheduled space lines. Something along the line of how heroic some of these guys are, that sort of stuff. Do up the idea they're always ready, fair weather or foul, to make an emergency trip." Carey said, "There isn't any weather, fair or foul, in space." Jake scowled at him. "You know what I mean, wise guy. Meanwhile, get some statements from some authorities." Ed Carey said painfully, "What statements? From what authorities?" The city editor glared at him. "So help me, Ed, I'm going to stick you on obituaries. Any statements from any authorities. You know damn well what I mean. Get some doctor to beef about the fact there aren't suitable hospitalization facilities on Luna. Get some president of one of the unscheduled space lines to sound off about what a hero Mooney is, and how much good these unscheduled space lines are. And that reminds me of something." He yelled to a tall, lanky reporter at the far end of the city room. "Hey, Ted, get Bunny on the line up in Oneonta, and tell her I said to look up some of these unscheduled space lines guys and see if she can get a photograph of Phil Mooney from them. Maybe he's got some buddies in Oneonta." There was one thing about being in free fall. You had lots of time to sit and think. Too much time, perhaps. You had time to think it all over and over and over again. There was the war which had torn you from the routine into which life had settled, from friends and relations and sweethearts, and thrown you into a one-man space fighter in which you sometimes stayed for weeks on end without communication with anyone, friend or foe. There had probably been no equivalent situation in the history of past warfare to the one-man space scouts. The nearest thing to them might have been the flyers of 1914 in the First World War, but of course they were up there alone only for hours at a time, not weeks. "You develop self-reliance, men," was the way the colonel had put it. You develop self-reliance or you're sunk. You're in space by yourself alone. You can't use your radio or they can locate you. If something happens, some emergency or some contact with the enemy, you're on your own. You have to figure it out. There's no superior officer to do your thinking. You're the whole works. And the colonel had been right, of course. It was a matter of using your own wits, your own ability. Fighting in a Space Scout was the work of an individual, not of a team. Perhaps it would be different someday in the future, when machines and instruments had been developed further, but now it was an individualistic game, each man for himself. And probably it was because of this training that he, Phil Mooney, was unable to get back into the crowd after the war had ended. He was an individualist who rebelled against working not only for, but even with someone else. He should have known better. Industry had reached beyond the point where one man goes out by himself and makes a fortune, or even a living, he thought wryly. It's the day of the big concerns, of tremendous trusts and cartels, who didn't even have to bother with the task of squeezing out tiny competitors like himself. He was out before he started. The Mooney Space Service. He snorted in self-depreciation. Oh, well. He pulled himself erect and made his way to the bunk. The kid was awake. He grinned down at her and said, "How's it going, Lillian?" Her eyes seemed glazed, even worse than they'd been yesterday, but she tried to smile back at him. "All right," she whispered, her child's voice so low he could hardly make it out. "Where's Mother?" Phil Mooney held a finger to his lips. "Maybe you'd better not talk too much, Lillian. Your mother and father they're all right. The thing right now is to get you to the hospital and make you well again. Understand?" Kitty Kildare was saying indignantly, "What's this about no insurance on Luna?" "Use your head, Kitty," Jake grunted. "What company'd be crazy enough to insure anybody working on Luna? By the way, that was a good piece on Mooney and the Marshall kid." "Did you read it?" Kitty Kildare was pleased. He shuddered. "Well, no, but the letters have been pouring in. Maybe you ought to do another. Take it from some other angle this time. That's why I wanted to know about the insurance. Do you realize that this child, this poor, sick, defenseless child, is penniless? Actually, I mean, bad enough that her parents have left her an orphan, but Jake, that child is penniless." All right, he told her. "Work on that for tomorrow's column." Ed came up with another radio-type report just as Kitty was leaving. "This guy's Mooney's calling all the other spaceports now, Jake. Evidently he is getting desperate. He's only 2 days out. And by the way, here's a new angle. This guy, Harry Marshall, the kid's father, was a wartime buddy of Phil Mooney. They went to cadet school or something together." Jake growled thoughtfully. "He hasn't got a chance, but it makes a tremendous story. Get somebody to rig up a set in the radio-type room, Ed, and we'll see if we can listen in." There was a desperate, tense, taut inflection in his voice now. "Calling New Albuquerque Spaceport or Oneonta Spaceport. Phil Mooney calling any Earth spaceport. Phil Mooney calling Oneonta, New Albuquerque, Casablanca, Mookton, any Earth spaceport. Emergency. Request landing instructions. Have Lillian Marshall, 8 years old, needing immediate medical care, aboard. Please come in any Earth spaceport. Calling Phil Mooney, New Albuquerque, calling Phil Mooney. Ambulance waiting on grounds, receiving you perfectly. Come in. Calling Phil Mooney, Casablanca Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney, Mookton Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney, Oneonta Spaceport, calling Phil Mooney." Ed Carey looked up over the set in the radio-type room at the city editor. He wet his lips carefully and said, He's only got 1 day now. They've got to pick him up in hours or he's sunk." Jake said, "I never did understand how that works. Why can't he land himself? I know he can't, but why?" The reporter shrugged. "I don't quite get it either, but evidently the whole operation is pretty delicate stuff. They bring him down with radar somehow or other. It's not like landing an airplane. Landing a spacecraft is done from the ground up, not from the spacecraft down. The pilot has comparatively little to do about it. At least that's the way it is with 9 ships out of 10. The set began to blare again, and they both listened tensely. It was Phil Mooney. "Listen, you guys down there, if you're sitting around playing craps or something, I'm going to have a few necks to break when I get down." The 2 newspapermen stared at each other over the set. Ed Carey ran his tongue over his lips again. The strained tone had gone from the voice of the space pilot now, and had been replaced by one of hopelessness. He said, "I don't know who I think I'm kidding. I know darn well there's something wrong with my receiver, and I can't find out what it is. Maybe the sender is off too, for all I know. All I can pick up is some girl singing something about white roses. White roses yet. I want landing instructions, and I get white roses." Ed Carey jerked his head up and snapped, "Holy jumping hell! He's able to pick some commercial station." Jake came to his feet, stuck his neck out of the door, and yelled at the top of his voice, "Phil Mooney is receiving some commercial station. Some dame singing something about white roses. Check every station in the city. Find out if any of them are broadcasting some dame singing about white roses." Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program for an emergency situation. Undoubtedly, you have heard on your newscasts and have read in your papers of the tragic case of Lillian Marshall, child victim of an atomic explosion on Luna, which orphaned her and necessitated her immediate flight to an Earth hospital. For the past 3 days, the spacecraft carrying her, piloted by war hero Philip Mooney, has been having trouble with his radio. Due to circumstances surrounding landing of spacecraft, the 2 have been given up as lost in spite of the fact that almost hourly it has been possible to receive messages from Mooney. It is now revealed that he is able to pick up this program on the Interplanetary Broadcasting System network. We are not sure which of the nearly 2,000 stations of our system he is receiving, but we will now attempt to reach Phil Mooney with relayed messages from the Oneonta spaceport, where expert medical care is awaiting little Lillian Marshall. Come in, Oneonta. "Calling Phil Mooney. Calling Phil Mooney. Come in, Phil. This is Oneonta spaceport, relaying through the Interplanetary Broadcasting System. Come in, Phil." "Phil Mooney, calling Oneonta. I'm getting you, Oneonta. Come in, Oneonta. Over." "Okay, Phil. Now this is it. We should have had you 2 hours ago, but we'll make out all right. Your velocity is a little too high. Give it 6 more units on your Kingston valves. Get that? Over." "Got it. 6 more units on the Kingstons. Over." "All right. Switch on your remote control, Phil. We'll take it from here. Stand by the coordinators." It was night, but a blaze of lights illuminated the Oneonta spaceport. Hundreds of land cars stood on the parking lots. Thousands of persons crowded the wire fence which kept all but port personnel from the field itself. The old space freighter sank easily to the apron, and in seconds the rocket flames died. A surge of humanity ebbed over the field toward the craft. Phil Mooney opened the pilot compartment's hatch and stuck his head out, blinking in surprise at the mob beneath him. "I don't know what this is all about," he began, "but I've got a sick kid aboard. There's supposed to be an ambulance." Police wedged through the crowd, conveying a white-haired, white-jacketed man. He called up to the space pilot. "We won't need an ambulance, Mr. Mooney. I've already made arrangements for facilities here at the airport for immediate treatment." Phil Mooney made his way to the ground and scowled, still obviously startled by the swelling crowd. "Who in Kurt are you?" he asked. The other motioned for two assistants to enter the ship and bring out the child. "I'm Dr. Kern," he said. "I'll see—" "Dr. Adrian Kern? The radiation expert?" The pilot frowned worriedly. "See here, Doctor, the Marshalls were friends of mine, and I've taken over the care of little Lillian, but I'm afraid I couldn't afford to pay you. I mean—" The famous doctor smiled at him. "I've been retained by the Interplanetary Golden Heart, Phil. You needn't worry about my fee. Besides," he smiled easily, "I'm not going to accept any fee for this case. You see, I was listening to Marcia Malloy singing 'Love of White Roses' when your call came through. I believe it was the most poignant experience I have ever been through." A girl next to the doctor gushed. "I'm Bunny Davis, Mr. Mooney. The managing editor of our newspaper chain has authorized me to buy your story for $5,000 if you'll just—" Phil Mooney blinked. I... A heavy-set man in a business suit grasped his hand and shook it with fervor, while flash bulbs went off blindingly. "Phil," he said huskily, as though moved by deep emotion, "as president of the board of directors of Terra Luna Spaceways, I wish to take this opportunity to offer you a full—" "Hey, give us a smile, Phil!" a man on top of a television truck yelled. He was headed back for Luna the next day. They'd been indignant, of course. There was Hollywood and the television networks, and that Terra Luna Spaceways guy who wanted to get in on all the publicity by offering him a vice presidency, and the newspaper editors and the magazine editors and all the rest of them. Approximately 1 billion persons had been tuned in to the Interplanetary Network when the emergency landing instructions had been broadcast to him through that system. 1 billion persons had sat on the edge of their chairs tensely as his ship had been brought in. He and little Lillian had received more publicity in the past 24 hours than anyone since Lindbergh. And the child would be all right now. Before he left, checks totaling over $250,000 had come in for her. Donations from all over the Earth and from Mars and Venus, and even some from the Jupiter satellites. And offers of adoption. Thousands of them, from rich and poor, even including Marcia Malloy, the video star who'd been singing that song, 'Love of White Roses.' Yes, Lillian would be all right. He wouldn't have been able to pay for the medical care she'd needed, but now she had the most capable experts on Earth at her disposal. They had been indignant when he blasted off again for Luna. They'd wanted to make a hero of him. This leaving on his part they interpreted as modesty, which, come to think of it, would make him all the more of a hero. Phil Mooney slipped a hand down to his set and flicked it on. He dialed over a dozen different stations. The news programs were all full of him and of Lillian. You'd think, to hear them, that he was the noblest, the most daring, the greatest man since Alexander the Great. He grinned wryly. One of the reasons he'd been so anxious to leave was to get away before somebody thought to check his set to see what was wrong with it. Why, if anybody had found that it was actually in perfect shape, they'd probably have lynched him. Yeah, the colonel had been right. In the Space Forces, you learned to be self-reliant. When you got in a bad spot, you figured it out yourself. You're on your own. It's you against everything and everybody. Anything goes. His grin broadened. Maybe he wasn't a hero, the way they were all painting him, but at least Lillian was all right now, and no longer penniless the way her parents' death had left her. And he wasn't doing so badly himself. End of Mercy Flight by Mack Reynolds. Story number 2 of 5 SF stories by Mack Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Summit. This story was first published in Astounding Science Fiction, February 1960. 2 king-sized bands blared martial music, the Internationale and the Star-Spangled Banner, each seemingly trying to drown the other in a Gotterdammerung of acoustics. Two lines of troops, surfacely differing in uniforms and in weapons, but basically so very the same, so evenly matched, came to attention. 1,000 hands slapped 1,000 submachine gun stocks. Marshal Vladimir Ignatov strode stiff-kneed down the long march, the stride of a man for years used to cavalry boots. He was flanked by frozen-visaged subordinates, but none so cold of face as he himself. At the entrance to the conference hall he stopped, turned, and waited. At the end of the corridor of troops a car stopped, and several figures emerged, most of them in civilian dress, several bearing briefcases. They in their turn ran the gauntlet. At their fore walked James Warren Donlevy, sprightly, his eyes darting here, there, politician-like, a half-smile on his face as though afraid he might forget to greet a voter he knew or was supposed to know. His hand was out before that of Vladimir Ignatov's. "Your Excellency," he said. Ignatov shook his hand stiffly, dropped that of the others as soon as protocol would permit. The field marshal indicated the door of the conference hall. "There is little reason to waste time, Mr. President." "Exactly," Donlevy snapped. The door closed behind them, and the two men, one uniformed and bemedaled, the other nattily attired in his business suit, turned to each other. "Nice to see you again, Vovo. How are Olga and the baby?" The soldier grinned back in response. "Two babies now. You don't keep up on the real news, Jim. How's Martha?" They shook hands. "Not so good," Jim said, scowling. "I'm worried. It's that new cancer. As soon as we conquer one type, two more rear up." "How are you people doing on cancer research?" Vovo was stripping off his tunic. He hung it over the back of one of the chairs, began to unbutton his high, tight military collar. "I'm not really up on it, Jim, but I think that's one field where you can trust anything we know to be in the regular scientific journals our people exchange with yours. I'll make some inquiries when I get back home, though. You never know, this new strain, I guess you'd call it, might be one that we're up on and you aren't." "Yeah," said Jim. "Thanks a lot." He crossed to the small portable bar. "How about a drink? Whiskey, vodka, rum? There's ice." Vovo slumped into one of the heavy chairs that were arranged around the table. He grimaced. "No vodka. I don't feel patriotic today." "How about one of those long cold drinks, with the cola stuff?" "Cuba Libre," Jim said. "Coming up. Look, would you rather speak Russian?" "No," Vovo said. "My English is getting rusty. I need the practice." Jim brought the glasses over and put them on the table. He began stripping off his own coat, loosening his tie. "God, I'm tired," he said. "This sort of thing wears me down." Vovo sipped his drink. "Now there's as good a thing to discuss as any in the way of killing time. The truth now, Jim. Do you really believe in a God, after all that's happened to this human race of ours? Do you really believe in divine guidance?" He twisted his mouth sarcastically. The other relaxed. "I don't know," he said. "I suppose so. I was raised in a family that believed in God, just as I suppose you were raised in one that didn't." He lifted his shoulders slightly in a shrug. "Neither of us seems to be particularly brilliant in establishing a position of our own." Vovo snorted. "Never thought of it that way," he admitted. "We're usually contemptuous of anyone still holding to the old beliefs. There aren't many left." "More than you people admit, I understand." Vovo shook his heavy head. "No, not really. Mostly crackpots. Have you ever noticed how it is that the nonconformists in any society are usually crackpots? The people on your side that admit belonging to our organizations are usually on the wild-eyed and uncombed hair side, I admit it. On the other hand, the people in our citizenry who subscribe to your system, your religion, that sort of thing, are crackpots too. Applies to religion as well as politics. An atheist in your country is a nonconformist. In mine, a Christian is. Both crackpots." Jim laughed and took a sip of his drink. Vovo yawned and said, "Oh, how long are we going to be in here?" "I don't know. Up to us, I suppose." "Yes. How about another drink? I'll make it." "How much of that cola stuff do you put in?" Jim told him, and while the other was on his feet mixing the drinks, said, "You figure on sticking on the same line this year?" "Have to," Vovo said over his shoulder. "What's the alternative?" "I don't know. We're building up to a whale of a depression as it is, even with half the economy running full blast producing defense materials." Vovo chuckled. "Defense materials. I wonder if ever in the history of the human race anyone ever admitted to producing offensive materials." "Well, you call it the same thing. All your military equipment is for defense. And of course, according to your press, all ours is for offense." "Of course," Vovo said. He brought the glasses back and handed one to the other. He slumped back into his chair again, loosened 2 buttons of his trousers. "Jim," Vovo said, "why don't you divert more of your economy to public works, better roads, reforestation, dams, that sort of thing?" Jim said wearily, "You're a better economist than that. Didn't your boy Marx, or was it Engels, write a small book on the subject? We're already overproducing, turning out more products than we can sell. I wasn't talking about your government building new steel mills, but dams, roads, that sort of thing. You could plow billions into such items and get some real use out of them. We both know that our weapons will never be used. They can't be." Jim ticked them off on his fingers. "We're already producing more farm products than we know what to do with. If we build more dams, it'll open up new farmlands and increase the glut. If we build more and better roads, it will improve transportation, which will mean fewer men will be able to move greater tonnage and throw transportation employees into the unemployed. If we go all out for reforestation, it will eventually bring down the price of lumber, and the lumber people are howling already. No," he shook his head, "there's just one really foolproof way of disposing of surpluses and using up labor power, and that's war, hot or cold." Vovo shrugged. "I suppose so." "It amounts to building pyramids, of course." Jim twisted his mouth sourly. "And since we're asking questions about each other's way of life, when is your state going to begin to wither away?" "How is that?" Vovo asked. "According to your sainted founder, once you people came to power, the state was going to wither away. Class rule would be over and utopia be on hand. That was a long time ago, and your state is stronger than ours." Vovo snorted. "How can we wither away the state as long as we are threatened by capitalist aggression?" Jim said, "Ha!" Vovo went on, "You know better than that, Jim. The only way my organization can keep in power is by continually beating the drums, keeping our people stirred up to greater and greater sacrifices by using you as a threat. Didn't the old Romans have some sort of maxim to the effect that when you're threatened with unease at home, stir up trouble abroad?" "You're being even more frank than usual," Jim said. "But that's one of the pleasures of these get-togethers. Neither of us resorts to hypocrisy. But you can't keep up these tensions forever." "You mean we can't keep up these tensions forever, Jim? And when they end? Well, personally, I can't see my organization going out without a bloodbath." He grimaced sourly. "And since I'd probably be one of the first to be bathed, I'd like to postpone the time. It's like having a tiger by the tail, Jim. We can't let go." "Happily, I don't feel in the same spot," Jim said. He got up and went to the picture window that took up one entire wall. It faced out over a mountain vista. He looked soberly into the sky. Vovo joined him, glass in hand. "Possibly your position isn't exactly the same as ours, but there'll be some awfully great changes if that military-based economy of yours suddenly had peace thrust upon it. You'd have a depression such as you've never dreamed of. Let's face reality, Jim. Neither of us can afford peace. Well, we've both known that for a long time. They both considered somberly, the planet Earth blazing away, a small sun there in the sky. Jim said, I sometimes think that the race would have been better off when man was colonizing Venus and Mars if it had been a joint enterprise rather than you people doing one and we the other. If it had all been in the hands of that organization, the United Nations, Vovo supplied. Then when Bomb Day hit, perhaps these new worlds could have gone on to, well, better things. Perhaps, Vovo shrugged. I've often wondered how Bomb Day started, who struck the spark. Happily, there were enough colonists on both planets to start the race all over again, Jim said. What difference does it make who struck the spark? None, I suppose. Vovo began to button his collar, readjust his clothes. Well, shall we emerge and let the quaking multitudes know that once again we have made a shaky agreement, one that will last until the next summit meeting. End of Summit. Story number 3 of 5 SF stories by Mack Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gun for Hire. This story was first published in Analog, December 1960. Joe Prantera called softly, Al. The pleasurable, comfortable, warm feeling began spreading over him the way it always did. The older man stopped and squinted, but not suspiciously, even now. The evening was dark. It was unlikely that the other even saw the circle of steel that was the mouth of the shotgun barrel, now resting on the car's window ledge. Who's it? He growled. Joe Prantera said softly, Big Louis sent me, Al. And he pressed the trigger. And at that moment the universe caved inward upon Joseph Marie Prantera. There was nausea, and nausea upon nausea. There was a falling through all space and through all time. There was doubling and twisting and twitching of every muscle and nerve. There was pain, horror, and tumultuous fear. And he came out of it as quickly and completely as he'd gone in. He was in, he thought, a hospital, and his first reaction was to think, This here California, everything's different. Then his second thought was, Something went wrong. Big Louis, he ain't gonna like this. He brought his thinking to the present. So far as he could remember, he hadn't completely pulled the trigger. That at least meant that whatever the rap was, it wouldn't be too tough. With luck, the syndicate would get him off with a couple of years at Quentin. A door slid open in the wall in a way that Joe had never seen a door operate before. This here California. The clothes of the newcomer were wrong, too. For the first time, Joe Prantera began to sense an alienness, a something that was awfully wrong. The other spoke precisely and slowly, the way a highly educated man speaks a language which he reads and writes fluently, but has little occasion to practice vocally. You have recovered? Joe Prantera looked at the other expressionlessly. Maybe the old duck was one of these foreign doctors, like. The newcomer said, You have undoubtedly been through a most harrowing experience. If you have any untoward symptoms, possibly I could be of assistance. Joe couldn't figure out how he stood. For one thing, there should have been some kind of police guard. The other said, Perhaps a bit of stimulant? Joe said flatly, I want a lawyer. The newcomer frowned at him. A lawyer? I ain't saying nothing. Not until I get a mouthpiece. The newcomer started off on another tack. My name is Lawrence Rustin Farrell. If I am not mistaken, you are Joseph Salviati Prantera? Salviati happened to be Joe's mother's maiden name. But it was unlikely this character could have known that. Joe had been born in Naples, and his mother had died in childbirth. His father hadn't brought him to the States until the age of 5, and by that time he had a stepmother. "I want a mouthpiece," Joe said flatly, "or let me out of here." Lawrence Rustin Farrell said, "You are not being constrained. There are clothes for you in the closet there." Joe gingerly tried swinging his feet to the floor and sitting up, while the others stood watching him strangely. He came to his feet. With the exception of a faint nausea, which brought back memories of that extreme condition he suffered during what? He hadn't the vaguest idea what had happened. He was dressed in a hospital-type nightgown. He looked down at it and snorted and made his way over to the closet. It opened on his approach, the door sliding back into the wall in much the same manner as the room's door had opened for Rustin Farrell. Joe Prantera scowled and said, "These ain't my clothes." "No, I am afraid not." "You think I'd be seen dead wearing this stuff? What is this, some religious crackpot hospital?" Rustin Farrell said, "I am afraid, Mr. Salviati Prantera, that these are the only garments available. I suggest you look out the window there." Joe gave him a long, chill look and then stepped to the window. He couldn't figure the other, unless he was a fruitcake. Maybe he was in some kind of pressure cooker, and this was one of the fruitcakes. He looked out, however, not on the lawns and walks of a sanitarium, but upon a wide boulevard of what was obviously a populous city. And for a moment again, Joe Prantera felt the depths of nausea. This was not his world. He stared for a long, long moment. The cars didn't even have wheels, he noted dully. He turned slowly and faced the older man. Rustin Farrell said compassionately, "Try this. It's excellent cognac." Joe Prantera stared at him, said finally, flatly, "What's it all about?" The other put down the unaccepted glass. "We were afraid first realization would be a shock to you," he said. "My colleague is in the adjoining room. We will be glad to explain to you if you will join us there." "I want to get out of here," Joe said. "Where would you go?" The fear of police, of Al Rossi's vengeance, of the measures that might be taken by Big Louis on his failure were now far away. Rustin Farrell had approached the door by which he had entered, and it reopened for him. He went through it without looking back. There was nothing else to do. Joe dressed, then followed him. In the adjoining room was a circular table that would have accommodated a dozen persons. 2 were seated there now, papers, books, and soiled coffee cups before them. There had evidently been a long wait. Rustin Farrell, the one Joe had already met, was tall and drawn of face and with a chain-smoker's nervousness. The other was heavier and more at ease. They were both, Joe estimated, somewhere in their middle 50s. They both looked like ducks. He wondered, all over again, if this was some kind of pressure cooker. But that didn't explain the view from the window. Rustin Farrell said, "May I present my colleague, Citizen Warren Brett James? Warren, this is our guest from yesteryear, Mr. Joseph Salviati Prantera." Brett James nodded to him, friendly so far as Joe could see. He said gently, "I think it would be Mr. Joseph Prantera, wouldn't it? The maternal lineage was almost universally ignored." His voice, too, gave the impression he was speaking a language not usually on his tongue. Joe took an empty chair, hardly bothering to note its alien qualities. His body seemed to fit into the piece of furniture as though it had been molded to his order. Joe said, "I think maybe I'll take that there drink, Doc." Rustin Farrell said, "Of course." And then something else Joe didn't get. Whatever the something else was, a slot opened in the middle of the table, and a glass, so clear of texture as to be all but invisible, was elevated. It contained possibly 3 ounces of golden fluid. Joe didn't allow himself to think of its means of delivery. He took up the drink and bolted it. He put the glass down and said carefully, "What's it all about, huh?" Warren Brett James said soothingly, "Prepare yourself for somewhat of a shock, Mr. Prantera. You are no longer in Los Angeles." "You think I'm stupid? I can see that." "I was about to say Los Angeles of 1960. Mr. Prantera, we welcome you to Nuevo Los Angeles." "To where?" "To Nuevo Los Angeles, and to the year—" Brett James looked at his companion. "What is the date, old calendar?" 2133, Reston Farrell said. 2133 A.D., they would say. Joe Prantera looked from one of them to the other, scowling. "What are you guys talking about?" Warren Brett James said softly, "Mr. Prantera, you are no longer in the year 1960. You are now in the year 2133. He said uncomprehendingly, "You mean I've been unconscious for—" He let the sentence fall away as he realized the impossibility. Brett James said gently, "Hardly for 170 years, Mr. Prantera." Reston Farrell said, "I am afraid we are confusing you. Briefly, we have transported you, I suppose one might say, from your own era to ours." Joe Prantera had never been exposed to the concept of time travel. He had simply never associated with anyone who had ever even remotely considered such an idea. Now he said, "You mean, like I've been asleep all that time?" "Not exactly," Brett James said, frowning. Reston Farrell said, "Suffice to say, you are now 173 years after the last memory you have." Joe Prantera's mind suddenly reverted to those last memories, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. He felt suddenly at bay. He said, "Maybe you guys better let me in on what's this all about." Reston Farrell said, "Mr. Prantera, we have brought you from your era to perform a task for us." Joe stared at him, and then at the other. He couldn't believe he was getting through to them, or at least that they were to him. Finally he said, "If I get this, you want me to do a job for you?" "That is correct." Joe said, "You guys know the kind of jobs I do?" "That is correct." "Like hell you do. You think I'm stupid? I never even seen you before." Joe Prantera came abruptly to his feet. "I'm getting out of here." For the second time, Reston Farrell said, "Where would you go, Mr. Prantera?" Joe glared at him. Then he sat down again as abruptly as he'd arisen. "Let's start all over again. I got this straight. You brought me some screwy way, all the way here, okay? I'll buy that. I seen what it looks like out that window." The real comprehension was seeping through to him even as he talked. "Everybody I know, Jesse, Tony, the kid, Big Louis, everybody, they're dead? Even Big Louis?" "Yes," Brett James said, his voice soft. "They are all dead, Mr. Prantera. Their children are all dead, and their grandchildren." The two men of the future said nothing more for long minutes, while Joe Prantera's mind whirled its confusion. Finally he said, "What's this bit about you wanting me to give it to some guy?" "That is why we brought you here, Mr. Prantera. You are a professional assassin." "Hey, wait a minute now." Reston Farrell went on, ignoring the interruption. "There is small point in denying your calling. Pray remember that at the point where we transported you, you were about to dispose of a contemporary named Alfonso Annunziata Rossi, a citizen, I might say, whose demise would probably have caused small dismay to society." "They had him pegged all right," Joe said. "But why me? Why don't you get some heavy from now? Somebody knows the ropes these days." Brett James said, "Mr. Prantera, there are no professional assassins in this age. nor have there been for over a century and a half. Well, then do it yourself. Joe Prantera's irritation over this whole complicated mess was growing, and already he was beginning to long for the things he knew, for Jessie and Tony and the others, for his favorite bar, for the lasagna down at Papa Giovanni's. Right now, he could have welcomed a calling down at the hands of Big Louis. Reston Farrell had come to his feet and walked to one of the large room's windows. He looked out as though unseeing. Then, his back turned, he said, "We have tried, but it is simply not in us, Mr. Prantera." "You mean you're yellow?" "No, if by that you mean afraid. It is simply not within us to take the life of a fellow creature, not to speak of a fellow man." Joe snapped, "Everything you guys say sounds crazy. Let's start all over again." Brett James said, "Let me do it, Lawrence." He turned his eyes to Joe. "Mr. Prantera, in your own era, did you ever consider the future?" Joe looked at him blankly. "In your day, you were confronted with national and international problems, just as we are today, and just as nations were a century or a millennium ago." "Sure. Okay, so we had problems. I know what you mean, like wars and depressions and dictators and like that." "Yes, like that," Brett James nodded. The heavy-set man paused a moment. "Yes, like that," he repeated. "That we confront you now indicates that the problems of your day were solved. Hadn't they been, the world most surely would have destroyed itself. Wars? Our pedagogues are hard put to convince their students that such ever existed. More than a century and a half ago, our society eliminated the reasons for international conflict. For that matter," he added musingly, "we eliminated most international boundaries. Depressions? Shortly after your own period, man awoke to the fact that he had achieved to the point where it was possible to produce an abundance of all with a minimum of toil. Overnight, for all practical purposes, the whole world was industrialized, automated. The second industrial revolution was accompanied by revolutionary changes in almost every field, certainly in every science. Dictators? Your ancestors found, Mr. Prantera, that it is difficult for a man to be free so long as others are still enslaved. Today, the democratic ethic has reached a pinnacle never dreamed of in your own era." Okay, Joe Prantera growled. "So everybody's got it made. What I want to know is what's all this about me giving it to somebody? If everything's so great, how come you want me to knock this guy off?" Reston Farrell bent forward and thumped his right index finger twice on the table. "The bacterium of hate, a new strain, has found the human race unprotected from its disease. We had thought our vaccines immunized us." "What's that supposed to mean?" Brett James took up the ball again. "Mr. Prantera, have you ever heard of Genghis Khan, of Tamerlane, Alexander, Caesar?" Joe Prantera scowled at him emptily. "Or more likely of Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin?" "Sure, I heard of Hitler and Stalin," Joe growled. "I ain't stupid." The other nodded. "Such men are unique. They have a drive to power which exceeds by far the ambitions of the average man. They are genii in their way, Mr. Prantera. Genii of evil. Such a genus of evil has appeared on the current scene." "Now we're getting somewhere," Joe snorted. "So you got a guy what's a little ambitious like, eh? And you guys ain't got the guts to give it to him. Okay, what's in it for me?" The two of them frowned, exchanged glances. Reston Farrell said, "You know, that is one aspect we had not considered." Brett James said to Joe Prantera, "Had we not, taken you at the time we did, do you realize what would have happened?" "Sure," Joe grunted. "I would have let old Al Rossi have it right in the gut 5 times. then I would have took the plane back to Chi." Brett James was shaking his head. "No, you see, by coincidence, a police squad car was coming down the street just at that moment to arrest Mr. Rossi. You would have been apprehended. As I understand California law of the period, your life would have been forfeit, Mr. Prantera." Joe winced. It did not occur to him to doubt their word. Reston Farrell said, "As to reward, Mr. Prantera, we have already told you there is ultra abundance in this age. Once this task has been performed, we will sponsor your entry into present-day society. Competent psychiatric therapy will soon remove your present—" "Wait a minute now. You figure on getting me candled by some head shrinker, eh? No thanks, Buster. I'm going back to my own—" Brett James was shaking his head again. "I am afraid there is no return, Mr. Prantera. Time travel works in one direction, with the flow of the time stream. There can be no return to your own era." Joe Prantera had been rocking with the mental blows he had been assimilating, but this was the final haymaker. He was stuck in this Squaresville of a world. Joe Prantera on a job was thorough, careful, painstaking, competent. He spent the first 3 days of his life in the year 2133 getting the feel of things. Brett James and Reston Farrell had been appointed to work with him. Joe didn't meet any of the others who belonged to the group which had taken the measures to bring him from the past. He didn't want to meet them. The fewer persons involved, the better. He stayed in the apartment of Reston Farrell. Joe had been right. Reston Farrell was a medical doctor. Brett James evidently had something to do with the process that had enabled them to bring Joe from the past. Joe didn't know how they'd done it, and he didn't care. Joe was a realist. He was here. The thing was to adapt. There didn't seem to be any hurry. Once the deal was made, they left it up to him to make the decisions. They drove him around the town when he wished to check the traffic arteries. They flew him about the whole vicinity. From the air, Southern California looked much the same as it had in its own time. Oceans, mountains, and to a lesser extent deserts, are fairly permanent even against man's corroding efforts. It was while he was flying with Brett James on the second day that Joe said, "How about Mexico? Could I make the get to Mexico?" The physician looked at him questioningly. "Get?" he said. Joe Prantera said impatiently, "The getaway. After I give it to this Howard Temple Tracy guy, I gotta go on the run, don't I?" "I see." Brett James cleared his throat. "Mexico is no longer a separate nation, Mr. Prantera. All North America has been united into one unit. Today there are only 8 nations in the world." "Where's the nearest?" "South America." "That's a hell of a long way to go on a get." "We hadn't thought of the matter being handled in that manner." Joe eyed him in scorn. "Oh, you didn't, huh? What happens after I give it to this guy? I just sit around and wait for the cops to put the arm on me?" Brett James grimaced in amusement. "Mr. Prantera, this will probably be difficult for you to comprehend, but there are no police in this era." Joe gaped at him. "No police? What happens if you gotta throw some guy in stir?" "If I understand your idiom correctly, you mean prison. There are no prisons in this era, Mr. Prantera." Joe stared. "No cops? No jails? What stops anybody? What stops anybody from just going into some bank like and collecting up all the bread?" Brett James cleared his throat. "Mr. Prantera, there are no banks." "No banks? You gotta have banks." "And no money to put in them. We found it a rather antiquated method of distribution well over a century ago." Joe had given up. Now he merely stared. Brett James said reasonably, "We found we were devoting as much time to financial matters in all their endless ramifications, including bank robberies, as we were to productive efforts. so we turned to more efficient methods of distribution. On the fourth day, Joe said, "Okay, let's get down to facts. Some of the things you guys say don't stick together so good. Now, first place, where's this guy Temple Tracy you want knocked off?" Reston Farrell and Brett James were both present. The three of them sat in the living room of the latter's apartment, sipping a sparkling wine which seemed to be the prevailing beverage of the day. For Joe's taste, it was insipid stuff. Happily, rye was available to those who wanted it. Reston Farrell said, "You mean, where does he reside?" "Why, here in this city." "Well, that's handy, eh?" Joe scratched himself thoughtfully. "You got somebody can finger him for me?" "Finger him?" "Look, before I can give it to this guy, I gotta know some place where he'll be at some time. Get it? Like Al Rossi. My finger, he works in Rossi's house, see? He lets me know every Wednesday night, 8 o'clock, Al leaves the house all by hisself. Okay, so I can make plans, like to give it to him." Joe Prantera wound it up reasonably. "You gotta have a finger." Brett James said, "Why not just go to Temple Tracy's apartment and, dispose of him?" "Just walk in, eh? You think I'm stupid? How do I know how many witnesses hanging around? How do I know if the guy's carrying heat?" "Heat?" "A gun, a gun. You think I'm stupid? I came to give it to him, and he gives it to me instead." Dr. Reston Farrell said, "Howard Temple Tracy lives alone. He customarily receives visitors every afternoon, largely potential followers. He is attempting to recruit members to an organization he is forming. It would be quite simple for you to enter his establishment and dispose of him. I assure you he does not possess weapons." Joe was indignant. "Just like that, eh?" he said sarcastically. "Then what happens? How do I get out of the building? Where's my get car parked? Where do I hide out? Where do I dump the heat?" "Dump the heat?" "Get rid of the gun. You and I should get caught with a gun on me? I'd wind up in the gas chamber so quick." "See here, Mr. Prantera," Brett James said softly. "We no longer have capital punishment, you must realize." "Okay, I still don't want to get caught. What is the rap these days, huh?" Joe scowled. "You said they didn't have no jails anymore?" "This is difficult for you to understand, I imagine," Reston Farrell told him. "But you see, we no longer punish people in this era." That took a long, unbelieving moment to sink in. "You mean, like, no matter what they do? That's crazy. Everybody'd be running around giving it to everybody else." "The motivation for crime has been removed, Mr. Prantera," Reston Farrell attempted to explain. "A person who commits a violence against another is obviously in need of medical care, and consequently receives it." "You mean, like, if I steal a car or something, they just take me to a doctor?" Joe Prantera was unbelieving. "Why would anyone wish to steal a car?" Reston Farrell said easily. "But if I give it to somebody—" "You will be turned over to a medical institution. Citizen Howard Temple Tracy is the last man you will ever kill, Mr. Prantera." A chilliness was in the belly of Joe Prantera. He said very slowly, very dangerously, "You guys figure on me getting caught, don't you?" "Yes," Brett James said evenly. "Well, then figure something else. You think I'm stupid?" "Mr. Prantera," Dr. Reston Farrell said, "there has been as much progress in the field of psychiatry in the past 2 centuries as there has in any other. Your treatment would be brief and painless, believe me." Joe said coldly, "And what happens to you guys? How do you know I won't rat on you?" Brett James said gently, "The moment after you have accomplished your mission, we plan to turn ourselves over to the nearest institution to have determined whether or not we also need therapy." "Now I'm beginning to wonder about you guys," Joe said. "Look, all over again, what do you want to give it to this guy for?" The doctor said, We explained the other day, Mr. Prantera. Citizen Howard Temple Tracy is a dangerous, atavistic, evil genius. We are afraid for our institutions if his plans are allowed to mature. Well, if you got things so good, everybody's got it made like, who'd listen to him? The doctor nodded at the validity of the question. Mr. Prantera, Homo sapiens is a unique animal. Physically, he matures at approximately the age of 13. However, mental maturity and adjustment is often not fully realized until 30 or even more. Indeed, it is sometimes never achieved. Before such maturity is reached, our youth are susceptible to romantic appeal. Nationalism, chauvinism, racism, the supposed glory of the military, all seem romantic to the immature. They rebel at the orderliness of present society. They seek entertainment in excitement. Citizen Temple Tracy is aware of this and finds his recruits among the young. Okay, so this guy is dangerous. You want him knocked off before he screws everything up. But the way things are, there's no way of making a get. So you'll have to get some other patsy, not me. I'm afraid you have no alternative, Brett James said gently. Without us, what will you do? Mr. Prantera, you do not even speak the language. What do you mean? I don't understand some of the big words you eggheads use, but I get by okay. Brett James said, Ammer English is no longer the language spoken by the man in the street, Mr. Prantera. Only students of such subjects any longer speak such tongues as Ammer English, French, Russian, or the many others that once confused the race with their limitations as a means of communication. You mean there's no place in the whole world where they talk American? Joe demanded, aghast. Dr. Reston Farrell controlled the car. Joe Prantera sat in the seat next to him, and Warren Brett James sat in the back. Joe had, tucked in his belt, a .45 caliber automatic, once displayed in a museum. It had been more easily procured than the ammunition to fit it, but that problem too had been solved. The others were nervous, obviously repelled by the very conception of what they had planned. Inwardly, Joe was amused. Now that they had got in the clutch, the others were on the verge of chickening out. He knew it wouldn't have taken much for them to cancel the project. It wasn't any answer, though. If they allowed him to call it off today, they'd talk themselves into it again before the week was through. Besides, already Joe was beginning to feel the comfortable, pleasurable, warm feeling that came to him on occasions like this. He said, You sure this guy talks American, eh? Warren Brett James said, Quite sure. He is a student of history. And he won't think it's funny I talk American to him, eh? He'll undoubtedly be intrigued. They pulled up before a large apartment building that overlooked the area once known as Wilmington. Joe was coolly efficient now. He pulled out the automatic, held it down below his knees, and threw a shell into the barrel. He eased the hammer down, thumbed on the safety, stuck the weapon back in his belt and beneath the jacket-like garment he wore. He said, Okay, see you guys later. He left them and entered the building. An elevator, he still wasn't used to their speed in this era, whooshed him to the penthouse duplex occupied by Citizen Howard Temple Tracy. There were 2 persons in the reception room, but they left on Joe's arrival without bothering to look at him more than glancingly. He spotted the screen immediately and went over and stood before it. The screen lit and revealed a heavy-set, dour-of-countenance man seated at a desk. He looked into Joe Prantera's face, scowled, and said something. Joe said, Joseph Salviati Prantera to interview Citizen Howard Temple Tracy. The other's shaggy eyebrows rose. Indeed, he said. In Ammer English? Joe nodded. Enter, the other said. The door had slid open on the other side of the room. Joe walked through it and into what was obviously an office. Citizen Temple Tracy sat at a desk. There was only one other chair in the room. Joe Prantera ignored it and remained standing. Citizen Temple Tracy said, What can I do for you? Joe looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he reached down to his belt and brought forth the .45 automatic. He moistened his lips. Joe said softly, "You know what this here is?" Temple Tracy stared at the weapon. "It's a handgun. Circa, I would say, about 1925, old calendar. What in the world are you doing with it?" Joe said very slowly, "Chief, in the line you're in these days, you need a heavy around with one of these. Otherwise, Chief, you're gonna wind up in some gutter with a lot of holes in you. What I'm doing? I'm asking for a job. You need a good man knows how to handle one of these, Chief." Citizen Howard Temple Tracy eyed him appraisingly. "Perhaps," he said, "you are right at that. In the near future I may well need an assistant knowledgeable in the field of violence. Tell me more about yourself. You surprise me considerably." "Sure, Chief. It's kinda a long story, though. First off, I better tell you, you got some bad enemies, Chief. Two guys special named Brett James and Doc Reston Farrell. I think one of the first jobs I'm gonna have to do for you, Chief, is to give it to those two." End of Gun for Hire. Story number 4 of 5 SF stories by Mack Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story number 4, Half Tripper. This story was first published in Planet Stories, November 1951. This section of New Santa Fe was off my beaten track. I'd been on Mars a long time and am more than usually familiar with the various centers where we Terrans do our congregating. However, it had been years since I'd come through here. I was sitting in an obscure tavern called, with commendable restraint, simply Sam's Bar, lapping up Martian brandy and facing the prospect of returning to the spaceport in a few hours with no particular enthusiasm. I only half noticed the old man who got up on the stool next to me. Sam came over and asked him what he'd have. The oldster carefully counted out some coins on the bar and said, "Wine, Sam, a glass of Martian wine." "You know I don't want your money, Joseph," Sam told him. The old man answered reproachfully, "The wine would taste that much the less, my friend, if I had not earned it by the sweat of my—" "Okay," Sam sighed. He poured the wine and rang up the money and went off to wait on someone else. A half-tripper sidled up to me. "How about a drink, spaceman?" he whined. "I'm a graduate of the Academy myself, class of '72. He must have noted my United Space Lines uniform. "Sorry," I said gruffly, keeping my back to him. Any spaceman can tell you that if you talk to a half-tripper for long, you'll soon be showing symptoms of space cafard yourself. The underlying terror in him, the mind-shattering fear of space, the way he stares at you, thinking that you can go home while he is afraid to risk the trip. There are few of them that can hide their disease. "I need a shot bad," he whispered urgently. He probably did, too. Few half-trippers are able to secure jobs on the planets of their exile. Most of them become beachcombers of space. Of course, there are some exceptions, especially if they have money and connections. I shuddered. "Beat it," I grated, hating myself and him. The fear of space cafard must be somewhat similar to that of seasickness every new sailor had back in ancient days when man sailed the oceans of Terra. He never knew until he made his first voyage if he was going to be susceptible, and if he turned out to be, it meant the sea wasn't for him. Of course, space cafard goes tragically further. A new man usually succumbs his first few hours in space, if he is going to get it at all. He probably makes it to the next planet, sometimes not. Sometimes he goes incurably mad right off the bat. But even if he does make it, wild horses could never get him on another rocket ship. He becomes a half-tripper, marooned on an alien world. Usually, although I have known of several exceptions, if you don't get it on your first trip, it seldom bothers you. You're immune for the rest of your life." He repeated, "How about it, spaceman?" Sam began to approach threateningly. He couldn't afford to have half-trippers hang out in his place. For one thing, the shipping lines would soon declare him out of bounds for their crews. You just can't let good men come in contact with obvious victims of space cafard. The old-timer Sam had called Joseph was distressed. "You know not what you say," he told me gently. I managed a sneer. "Am I supposed to buy a drink for every space bum that comes along?" The half-tripper's eyes lit up and came closer to the old man. "How about it, Pop? Could you loan me the price of a nip of wojie?" Joseph's face was compassionate. "I am sorry, brother. I myself have nothing, but I commend you to the generosity of the tavern keeper." I snorted at that. I could imagine how much generosity the space leper would get from the bartender. That's where the surprise came. Sam sighed. "Okay, half-tripper, what'll it be?" The space bum ordered a double wojie, got it down quickly as though he was afraid Sam might change his mind, and then beat it to find a place to have his dreams when the full force of the also narcotic drink hit him. I finished my brandy, ordered another, and grinned wryly at the old-timer. "You gave me Kurt for telling him to beat it, but you gave Sam the high sign to let him have wojie with which to rot out his brains. I think I was being the kinder of the two of us." "Each man's salvation is within himself," Joseph said softly. "You won't redeem him by attempting to keep him from his weaknesses." "You talk like a saint, but I notice you're sitting here at a bar." He looked at me penetratingly, and there was vast emptiness behind his eyes. "There is little to enjoy in life," he said softly, "but I have had ample time to investigate all of the supposed pleasures. At one time I drank greatly, and kept myself in a state of continual intoxication for a period longer than you could believe. Then I went through a state when I let nothing pass my lips but water. Now I see the mistake of both extremes, and can enjoy an occasional glass without feeling the need of swilling it down until intoxication dulls me." He had me interested now. I said, "You sound as though you found the way in which to get the greatest satisfaction from everything in life, but I notice that you don't appear particularly happy." He was silent for a long time. Finally he sighed and answered, "Happiness is not to be found in wine, nor in food, nor in beautiful women, nor even in wealth and power. It is from within. What you have done, what you are in the eyes of your fellow man." He looked as though he was about to say more, but he fell silent, his eyes on something far away, although he seemed to be looking directly into my face. Then a light returned to them, and he came back to our conversation. "I am sorry," he said. "For a moment you reminded me of someone I knew long and long ago. But now I must be on my way." He left his drink half finished on the bar and walked wearily to the door. Sam took his glass away and wiped the bar reflectively. "Whenever he's here I can't turn down any half-trippers or other space bums," he complained. "I tried it once, and the old boy looked so pathetic that I damn near cried myself." "He seems to be quite a character," I said, only half interested. "Sure," Sam said. "Haven't you heard about Joseph? He's immortal." "What?" I said, startled. "Immortal. You know, he lives forever." He poured me another brandy and leaned on the bar. His other customers had left, and he was obviously in the mood for talking. "I thought everybody knew about Joseph," he went on. "He was one of the first space barons, a real big shot, controlled the whole of Calypso, him and his brother. They not only personally owned all of the satellite, but even all of the space lines that served it. When it came to law there, he was judge, jury, and owner of the courthouse and jail. Brother, that was one monopoly." "You mean that old man that was just here?" I said in amazement. "That's right. Joseph, we call him now. He probably had a longer name then. It was a long time ago. Anyway, to get back to the story, one day a space liner radios in that it wants to make an emergency landing on Calypso for medical assistance. They had some virulent disease on board, and the passengers and crew were dying like flies. Well, this brother of Joseph, Michael, or something like that his name was, advises Joseph not to give them permission to land. The captain of the liner pleads with him, but Joseph tells him to move on. He doesn't want to take any chances. The ship tried to make the next port, I forget just what it was. But anyway, to cut it short, they all died. That's what started things churning in Joseph's bailiwick, a full-scale revolution, no less. You missed something there, I said. The people wouldn't have been expected to be so upset. After all, no matter how mistaken, he must have thought he was acting in the interest of everyone on Calypso. Yeah, Sam pointed out, but the thing is that among the passengers was Joseph's own boy, the most popular person on the satellite and the apple of his old man's eye. Nobody had known it, but the kid was playing hooky from his school on Terra and was making a cruise of the Jupiter moons. Joseph himself had never been very popular with his people. Neither had this younger brother of his, Michael. Too strict, you see. But everybody liked the boy and were looking forward to the day when he'd take over the reins of government. When it came out what happened, they went berserk. They cornered Joseph and Michael and a dozen or so of their close associates in the palace, which was actually more of a fortress than anything else. Sam wiped the bar again without need, and said reflectively, "It must have been quite a fight. Not that Joseph himself participated. The boy had been his whole life, and he just moved around like he was in a trance. They threw everything at that palace, every weapon, every device that had been thought up for centuries, but it didn't crack. Finally, the fight was ended by a fleet of battle cruisers from Terra. Joseph and Michael and the rest were removed and brought here to Mars. None of them dared to remain on Calypso." I poured myself another brandy from the bottle that Sam had left on the bar. "You make quite a story of it," I told him. "But you didn't tell me what you started to, about the immortality." "Yeah," he said, "that's right. Well, it seems that in the atomic bombardment of the palace, something happened that wound up with Joseph and his friends all immortal. Don't ask me what. I don't know, and neither did these scientist guys when they tried to figure it out. Of course, it didn't become known for years. Not until it became obvious they weren't dying, or even aging. They continued to appear as they had at the time of the fight. I don't mean they couldn't die at all. One by one they dropped away. Two were lost in space, one was blown up in an explosion on Terra, another was burned to death. But the only way they could die was through accident or suicide. After a few hundred years they were all gone but Joseph, and of course he's gone batty." I interrupted. "You mean he's insane?" The bartender grinned. "Crazy as a macron." I said slowly, "He seemed normal enough to me. Perhaps a bit eccentric." Sam said, "Brother, he's as far around the corner as you can get. You know what he thinks? He thinks that he's wandering through space, going from planet to planet, trying to find a situation similar to that in which he sent away the person he loved most to his death. He thinks that if he ever finds that similar situation, he'll be able to make the opposite decision from the one he made before, and that will redeem him." I frowned. "Where does he get the money for his wandering around the planets?" "He don't need no money. He's good luck. There's not a captain in the system that would refuse free passage to old Joseph." Sam shrugged his beefy shoulders. "And who am I to say otherwise? That's why I give the bums free drinks when he's around. So does every other bartender." Two customers had entered, and Sam made his way down to them, leaving me alone. A half-tripper scurried through the door and cringed up to me. He whimpered, "How about a drink, spaceman? I flipped him a coin. "Sure, buddy," I said, repressing my usual nausea at the sight of him. I got down from my stool and made my way out. It was time for me to return to the spaceport and my job. I suppose that I forgot to tell the cabbie to take me to the administration building entrance, the first time I'd made that mistake in years. I was preoccupied with thoughts of Joseph and the story Sam had told me. The guards at the main gate must have let us through without question when they saw my United Space Lines uniform. At any rate, when I looked up, it was too late. Not only was I on the landing field and in full view of the concrete takeoff aprons, but one gigantic freighter was in the process of blasting off. All the horror of it flowed over me with a rush. The careful training of years, the work of doctors who had treated me, all my own self-discipline, were gone. I shook with terrified frenzy. The depths of space, the free fall, the black emptiness, the utter, uncontrollable terror. I screamed shrilly, and the cabbie turned wide-eyed to stare at me. He knew the symptoms. "Space cafard! A half-tripper!" he gasped, and spun the cab about to get me to a hospital. He must have realized then that my uniform didn't necessarily mean that I worked on the liners themselves, but that I could be an office employee who only on rare occasions went near the ships. He knew, too, that the very sight of a spaceship blasting off was enough to put me in bed for a week, and that I was uncommonly lucky to have the funds for the hospitalization. Mars was strewn with the human wrecks of half-trippers who hadn't. As we whirled from the yard, we passed the bent figure of Joseph walking unhurriedly toward a liner which was loading for the Venus run. My heart cried out, even through my terror, my sickness. "Joseph, Joseph, so you too are alive and still seeking forgiveness. I had thought I was the last. But you are by far the better off of we two, Joseph, for at least you have been free to wander, while I have stayed on this one hated spot since all those centuries ago when we fled from Calypso and the wrath of the people who had loved the boy so. As though we hadn't loved him ourselves, Joseph. Yes, you are the better off. You can seek throughout the stars for forgiveness. Then, too, your mind is forever dulled with your madness, while mine is horribly aware, always, of what we've been through, and of the centuries ahead. It is only blurred when the space cafard comes. Joseph, Joseph, you didn't even recognize your brother Michael, nor I you, when we met." End of Half-Tripper. Story number 5 of 5 SF Stories by Mack Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Galactic Ghost. This story was first published in Planet Stories of March 1954. Despite the widely publicized radar posts encircling our nation and the continuously alerted jet squadrons at its borders, the spaceship was about to land before it was detected. It settled gracefully, quietly, onto an empty field in northern New Jersey. And so unexpected was the event, so unbelievable the fact that man was being visited by aliens from space, that it was a full half-hour before the first extra was on the streets in New York, and 40 minutes before the news buzzed through the Kremlin. It might have taken considerably longer for man in Earth's more isolated areas to hear of the event had not the alien taken a hand at this point. Approximately an hour after the landing, into the mind of every human on Earth, irrespective of nation, language, age, or intellect, came the thought telepathically, "We come in peace. Prepare to receive our message." It was a month before the message came. During that period, more than 99% of the Earth's population became aware of the visitor from space. Radio, television, newsreel, telegraph, and newspapers reached the greatest number, but word of mouth and even throbbing drums played their part. In 4 weeks, Savages along the Amazon and shepherds in Xinjiang knew that visitors from the stars had arrived with a message for man, and all awaited the message. Scientist and soldier, politician and revolutionist, millionaire and vagrant, bishop and whirling dervish, banker and pickpocket, society matron and streetwalker. And each was hoping for one thing, and afraid he'd hear another. All efforts at communication with the alien ship had failed. The various welcoming delegations from the state of New Jersey, from the United States, and even from the United Nations were ignored. No sign of life aboard was evident, and there seemed no means of entrance to the spacecraft. It sat there impassively. Its tremendous saucer-like shape seemed almost like a beautiful monument. At the end of a month, when worldwide interest in the visitor from space was at its height, the message came. And once again it was impressed upon the mind of every human being on Earth. Man, know this. Your world is fated to complete destruction. Ordinarily, we of the Galactic Union would not have contacted man until he had progressed much further and was ready to take his place among us. But this emergency makes necessary that we take immediate steps if your kind is to be saved from complete obliteration. In order to preserve your race, we are making efforts to prepare another planet, an uninhabited one, to receive your colonists. Unfortunately, our means of transporting you to your new world are limited, and only a handful can be taken. You are safe for another 5 of your Earth years. At the end of that period we will return. Have 1,000 of your people ready for their escape." The President of the United States lifted an eyebrow wearily and rapped again for order. "Gentlemen, please, let us get back to the fundamental question. Summed up, it amounts to this. Only 1,000 persons out of a world population of approximately 2 billions are going to be able to escape the Earth's destruction. In other words, 1 out of every 2 million. It is going to be most difficult to choose." Herr Ernst Oberfeld tapped his glasses fretfully on the conference table. "Mr. President, it need not be quite as bad as all that. After all, we must choose the Earth's best specimens to carry on our race. I believe we will find that the combined populations of Europe and North America total somewhat less than 1 billion. If we go still further and eliminate all inferior—" Monsieur Pierre Duclos flushed. Herr Oberfeld should keep in mind that his presence at this meeting at all was opposed vigorously by some of the delegates. Isn't it somewhat too soon after his country's debacle to again broadcast its super-race theories? The British representative spoke up. "My dear Duclos, although I agree with you completely in essence, still it must be pointed out that if we were to handle this allocation on a strictly numerical basis, that our Chinese friends would be allotted something like 200 colonists, while Great Britain would have perhaps 20. Maxim Gregorov grunted. "Hardly enough for the royal family, eh?" Lord Harriman was on his feet. "Sir, I might echo what Monsieur Duclos has said to Herr Oberfeld. It was in spite of the protests from a considerable number of delegates to this conference that your nation is represented at all." Gregorov's fist thumped on the table, and his face went beet red. "It is as expected. You plan to monopolize the escape ship for the imperialistic nations. The atom bomb will probably be used to destroy all other countries." The President of the United States held up his hand. This whole thing was getting more chaotic by the minute. As a matter of fact, instructions from Congress were that he explain that the United States expected to have at least 1/3 of the total. This, in view of the fact that the aliens had landed in New Jersey, obviously seeing that the United States was the foremost nation of the world, and further, in view of the fact that this country was a melting pot of all nations, and consequently produced what might be called the average member of the human race. However, that would have to wait. Order had to be brought to this conference if anything was to be accomplished. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, please," he called. "These accusations, we are getting nowhere. I have taken the liberty to make arrangements to have the representative of the newly formed Congress of American Sciences address you. Are you agreeable?" He raised his eyebrows inquiringly, and, meeting no objection, pressed the button on the table before him. Professor Manklethorpe was ushered in, bobbed his head to the assembled delegates, and came to the point immediately. "The problem which you are discussing has many ramifications. I would like to bring to your attention a few which should be examined with care. First, the choice of colonists must not be on a national basis, nor on one based upon political or monetary prominence. If it is, we as a race are doomed. This new planet, no matter how well prepared for us by the Galactic Union, is going to be a challenge such as man has never faced before. This challenge cannot be met by politicians, no matter how glib, nor by wealthy men, no matter how many dollars they possess, nor by titled ones, no matter how old and honored their names. We must pick trained specialists who will be able to meet the problems that arise in the New World. Our Congress recommends that all persons of all nations who have college degrees be given thorough tests both for IQ and for accumulated knowledge, and that the highest 1,000 be chosen irrespective of nation or race." Pandit Harikoanai smiled quietly. "May I ask the learned professor a question?" "Of course. That is why I am here. We want only to have this matter decided on a strictly scientific basis. My poverty-stricken country has a population of possibly 1/5 of the world total, but fewer university men than one of your large cities might boast. Your desire to choose men by their IQ has its merits, but I have no doubt that in my country we have men of tremendous intelligence who cannot even read and write, aside from having a university degree. Must my widely illiterate people go unrepresented in the New World?" A muscle twitched in the professor's face. "Needless to say, the Congress of American Sciences has considered that. However, we must view this matter in a spirit of sacrifice. The best of the world's population must go to the New World. Possibly whole nations will go without representation. It is too bad, but unfortunately necessary." Sven Carlson put up his finger for recognition. "It seems to me that there is another serious loophole in the professor's recommendation. He wants the 1,000 to be made up of university graduates of high IQ and considerable accumulated knowledge. I am afraid I foresee the New World being populated with elderly scholars." He smiled. "Like the professor himself, who I understand has a phenomenal IQ." Monsieur Duclos nodded. "He is right. We must consider the need to send perfect physical specimens." He looked down at his own small and bent body. "Gentlemen," he said wryly, "has it occurred to you that none of us here at this conference are suitable to be represented among the 1,000? They ignored him. A pale-faced delegate in black, who had thus far said nothing, spoke up softly. "I have been instructed to inform you that our organization demands that all of the colonists be of the true faith." His words were drowned by the shouting of half a dozen of the conference delegates. Loud above them all could be heard the bellow of Maxim Gregorov. "Our union now includes the population of approximately half the world. Our allotment consequently will be 500 colonists of the 1,000. We will choose them by our own methods." Lord Harriman murmured, "Undoubtedly, by starting at the top of the party membership list and taking the first 500 names, beginning with your leader." The President of the United States ran his hand through his hair and then roughly down the side of his face. A messenger handed him a slip of paper. He read it and intensified his pounding on the table. "Gentlemen," he shouted, If Professor Monculthorpe is through, we have here a request from the International Physical Culture Society to have their representative heard." "I know," Sven Carlson said. "He wants all of the colonists to be able to chin themselves 25 times as the first requisite." At the end of the 5-year period, the spaceship came again, settling into the identical field where it had first landed. This time, a delegation awaited it, and a multitude that stretched as far as the eye could see. A telepathic message came from the visitor from space almost immediately. "Choose from your number 3 representatives to discuss the situation with us." Within 10 minutes, 3 advanced and entered the ship by way of a port that opened before them as they approached. Among their number was Pierre Duclos. A passage stretched before them, and seeing no one, they hesitated a moment before following it to its further end. Monsieur Duclos led the way, depending only slightly on his cane to aid his bent body. A door opened, and they were confronted by the figure of a man seated at a desk. It was several moments before they realized that the entity before them was masked so cleverly that they had been led to believe him human. He said in faultless English, "I note that you have penetrated my disguise. I thought it would be easier for you if I hid my true appearance. Until your people are used to alien life forms, I must use this measure." Monsieur Duclos bowed. "We appreciate your consideration, but I assure you that our—" The alien waved a gloved hand. "Please, no argument. My appearance would probably nauseate you, but it is of no importance. Pray be seated." He noted the cane and nodded to the little Frenchman. "You, sir, must be highly thought of to rate being chosen one of the 1,000 in view of your age and health." Although he was not at ease in the presence of the representative of the Galactic Union, Monsieur Duclos allowed himself a wry smile. "You misunderstand. I am not one of the colonists. My presence here at this meeting is an honor that has been awarded me in return for some small services in aiding in the selection of the favored ones." "And what were these services?" "Of no real importance. I suppose you might say that the most important was that I was the first to refuse to be a colonist." Bentley, one of the other Earthmen, spoke up. "Had it not been for Pierre Duclos, it is doubtful that the 1,000 would have been chosen, and even possible that there would be no Earth to which to return for your colonists." Behind the mask, the eyes of the alien gleamed. "Enlighten me further, please." Duclos demurred. "You honor me overmuch, Mr. Bentley. Let us approach the problem of the colonists and their transportation." But John Bentley went on. "For more than 2 years after your ship's departure, complete confusion reigned in regard to selection of the 1,000. Happily, all-out warfare between nations had been avoided, although conditions were rapidly coming to a point where it was momentarily expected. Each race, each nation, each religion, even each sex, thought they should have the greater representation. And each of these groups in turn were divided into subgroups by wealth, age, class, education, and others. Almost everybody on Earth knew of some reason why he should be one of the colonists. And most of us were willing to take any steps to make our desire come true." The alien said, "That was to be expected. And then?" "And then Pierre Duclos formed his Society of Racial Preservation, whose first requisite for membership was a refusal to become one of the colonists. The purpose of the organization was to find the 1,000 most suitable colonists without regard to race, nationality, creed, color, education, class, wealth, or any other grouping. At first, the growth of membership was slow, but after a time, man saw that his chance of survival as an individual was practically nil, that his chance of being chosen was at best less than 1 in 2 million. When he realized this, his next desire was to make sure that Even though he as an individual was doomed, the race survived. Membership in the society grew rapidly and internationally. The members, you might say, were fanatical. Why not? They knew that they had less than 5 years to live. Why not sacrifice those last years of life in such a noble cause? As the society grew in strength, nothing could stand before it. Governments that stood in the way were overthrown, social systems abolished, prejudices and institutions that had stood for centuries were wiped out. It became necessary to institute world government to guarantee to all equal opportunity. Step by step, the society took the measures necessary to ensure the selection of the best specimens Earth had to offer. And scientific development was pushed to the utmost. We wished to send our colonists off with as much as Earth could possibly give them. We eliminated a dozen diseases that have plagued us for centuries. We devised 1,000 new tools and techniques. In short, said the alien, because of this stimulus, man has progressed as much in this past 5 years as he could have expected in the next 50. That is correct, Pierre Duclos said. It is unfortunate that now we have on our threshold a world really worth living in, that it is fated to be destroyed. I see, said the alien. What would have been a smile on a human face flickered on his. I am glad to report that the danger which confronted the Earth has been removed, and the need to populate the new planet with colonists in order to preserve your race is now eliminated. Gentlemen, the Earth is safe. Man may go on with his plans without fear of destruction. Monsieur Duclos fingered his cane thoughtfully, while the other 2 Earthmen jumped to their feet, thumped each other's backs, shouted, and otherwise demonstrated their joy. They finally dashed from the room and from the spacecraft to give the news to the world. The alien eyed the little Frenchman. And why have you remained? I do not believe the world was faced with destruction, monsieur. I have come to the conclusion that you have perpetrated a farce upon mankind. The alien sat himself down at the desk again. I see you will need an explanation, but you are wrong, you know. Faced with destruction, you were. The destruction, however, was not a matter of collision with some other body, or whatever you might have imagined. The destruction would have come from within. Man was on the verge of destroying himself. One more conflict, or at most 2, would have done it. The Galactic Union has long been aware of man, who has developed mechanically in a phenomenal manner, but has not been able to develop socially to the point where his science is less than a danger. This ship was sent to you in hopes of accomplishing exactly what has been accomplished. We believed your racial instinct would be strong enough to unite you when the race as a whole thought it was threatened with extinction. The alien got to his feet. I am afraid we must leave now. Let me say that I hope that man will soon be able to take his place in the Galactic Union. Monsieur Duclos winced. The Galactic Union, he said. The League of Nations and the United Nations were bad enough. He smiled wryly. And I thought that with the establishment of a world government, we had abolished such conferences forever. I can just see myself as the first delegate from Earth. Heaven forbid. End of The Galactic Ghost. End of 5 science fiction stories by Mack Reynolds. These stories read by Phil Chenevert. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, June 2021.